Hello everyone, welcome to the launch of the Responsible Mining Index 2022. We're really pleased to have you with us today. We'll be sharing some of the findings from this year's index and hearing some perspectives from some wonderful panelists. And we're also looking forward to hearing from yourselves. So do please share questions. We've got over 1,000 participants registered from nearly 100 different countries. So we really thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to hearing from you. My name is Ed O'Keefe, and I'll be moderating this webinar. I'm a director at Synergy Global Consulting, and we've been a research partner with the Responsible Mining Foundation to helping develop the index. Firstly, just some practicalities for the webinar. Interpretation is available in 5 languages: English, French, Spanish, Chinese, and Russian. So to select a language, click on the planet icon and pick the language you want. The button's located at the bottom of the application if you're on a computer, and the upper right corner in the More menu if you're using a smartphone. Also, maybe just to sort of tidy up your screen, you can right-click on any of the videos of the participants and select Hide Non-Video Participants. So then you'll only see those participants, those panelists with their video on. So that might make it easier to see. We'll also be taking questions in written format throughout the event. If you want to send a question, use the question and answer function of Zoom. The button's located at the bottom of the application if you're on a computer, and again in the upper right corner if you're using a smartphone. And we'll try to address as many of the questions as time allows. So let's get started. One milestone that I remember well in developing the Responsible Mining Index was when we saw the first results come through in early 2018. After months of many people's really hard research, the results were still being reviewed, and so they were still double-blinded to limit any bias in the review process. Basically, this meant that we couldn't see the company names, and instead the names have been replaced by titles of Pink Floyd and Chuck Berry albums, a tradition that we still carry on in the index. The challenge at times had seemed impossible: to develop an index which assessed some of the largest companies in the sector across the full breadth of ESG issues, and managed to compare them across the diversity of commodities, the ownership types, the different home and host countries of the mining companies, and all of this only using publicly available information and a publicly accessible methodology. After all the blood, sweat and tears that have been put in by the team, it was amazing to see those first charts showing the different levels of performance across the thematic areas for each of the companies. And just as you can see in the report and online today. But we also knew that those results in 2018 were only the first step. The founding intent of the Responsible Mining Index was to emphasize improvement and learning and leading practice. So it was important to show change over time, as well as those first sets of results. If you're a bit of a geek, you might have dived into the index methodology, which you can download from the Responsible Mining Index website. And you may have noticed that some of the metric questions for effectiveness indicators start with the wording, tracks and discloses data against targets and across successive time periods. A seemingly simple question asking whether companies show changes in performance relative to previous years. So now we can start to look at performance, step back and look at performance across successive years of the index. It's also important to recognize that we're looking at improvement over a much longer period than just those 6 years of the index. The Responsible Mining Index perhaps has its roots in some of the tectonic shifts which happened in the mining industry 2 decades ago, when the mining industry was at a crisis point in its relationship with society. The building blocks of our architecture now for responsible mining emerged from that time 20 years ago. Publish What You Pay, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, ICMM, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and new professional disciplines like social performance all have their roots in that period. So with the third Responsible Mining Index report, we're now at a point where we can step back and track progress across time and perhaps even over those 2 decades. So during this webinar, we'd like to explore a few questions. What can we learn from changes over time which are reflected in the results? What challenges still face us, and where do we most need to improve in the future? And what leading practices are going to help us address those challenges? So to help us answer those questions, I'm really delighted to have a great lineup of panelists to give their responses, not only to the RMI findings, but also share some of their experiences and their organisation experiences over those 20-year plus time period. So we have Elisa Peter from Publish What You Pay, Tania Tchedaeva from Polymetal, Glen Mpufane from IndustriALL, and Luke Zandvliet from RRR Alliance, and Rohitesh Dhawan from ICMM. So we're really looking forward to hearing from all of them. But to start off, I'd like to introduce the CEO of the Responsible Mining Foundation, Hélène Piaget, to talk us through some of the findings. So Hélène, if you could turn on your video. And Hélène, I'd like to ask you, this is the 3rd edition of the Responsible Mining Index report. What are the key findings and what stands out for the Responsible Mining Foundation after 6 years of ESG assessment? Hélène.
Hello, and thank you, Ed. And of course, greetings to everyone joining us today. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce this discussion on where the mining industry is at by sharing the results of the RMI Report 2022. Apologies. Okay, apologies. That's all technology. That's not playing along. So before we look at some of the results of the latest RMI report, it is worth reminding ourselves of the context of why we focus on responsible mining. Well, we know by now that mining is an indispensable industry. The energy transition is just one prominent example of that. Yet there is a constant tension between society's need for the products of mining and the harmful impacts that mining can and does cause. So society finds itself in a constant conflict of interest and a conflict of conscience when it comes to the mining industry. Now, this report measures how a sample of mining companies are responding to the economic, environmental, social, and governance expectations of society. But the same companies that can show that they are making some progress on ESG policies and procedures could at the same time be a company that causes harm to people and environments in any number of ways. So this is the contradiction that we have when we try to encourage continuous improvement. So the reason the Responsible Mining Foundation and many others work to normalize responsible mining is exactly because of the potential harm that mining can cause. Now, moving on to the scope of what we cover in the report. The report covers 40 large mining companies who together represent around 30% of the value of global production. These companies are responsible for around 1,000 operational and closed mine sites across 53 countries, and they include listed, private, and state-owned entities. Going along the line of more information on the detail, you'll see that we also cover 250 mine sites. These are selected from the mine sites across all the countries and across, obviously, the companies. So why do we select the mine sites and have a particular look at mine site detail? Because mine sites matter, as this is where most salient harm can happen to people and environments, where the impacts of climate change are evident. So it is important to observe whether company systems are in fact being implemented as intended at the operations. The thematic scope looks something like this, and it is enclosed in the framework, the RMI framework, which you will also find on the website. The areas, the thematic areas that we cover are the 6 on the left of your screen. So these include economic development, business conduct, life cycle management, community well-being, working conditions, environmental responsibility. And then if you look on the right of your screen, you'll see that we also provide insight on a number of transversals or cross-cutting issues that are embedded within the thematic areas. And these are human rights, gender, harm prevention, and climate change. So what do the results show us? Well, as an overall observation, it is good to note that one does see signs of continuous improvement. Things are moving in the right direction, although with some slowing down now in 2022. The overall results for 2020 showed an average increase of 16% on the previous report. And the 22 report now shows an average increase of 11%. So as I said, some slowing down. Given the fact, though, that most companies have showed substantive profits of late, one cannot ascribe this slowing down of momentum to the pandemic alone. So we do have questions to ask about the slowing down. Here you see that each bar represents one of the 40 companies in the report. The chart represents the overall momentum of improvement, with the lower scoring companies on the right of the chart showing an average 41% increase on their previous results. This was very encouraging to see. Whereas the better performing companies on the left of the chart show only an average 8% improvement. Clearly, there's some catching up happening, and it is encouraging to see that this is not only at the level of new commitments, but also around implementation, various implementation measures. At the same time, one should question why the better performing companies are slowing their momentum towards responsible mining practices. Do they feel that they are doing okay compared to their peers, that this is good enough? Are the leaders displaying ESG fatigue or not being meaningfully challenged by investors and regulators? So one wonders. Looking at the vertical space, the open space above the bars, it's clear that there's still a long way to go to reach the expectations of society on responsible mining. Now, if we look at the mine site level, the most important finding we see is the lack of disaggregated evidence at the mine site level. Here we've measured only 15, but of the most basic elements affecting local people, workers, and the environment. On the screen, you will see 4 sets of results, and these are related particularly to local employment, water quality, community grievance, and worker safety. Each dot that you see there represents one of the 250 assessed mine sites, and the gray dots indicate where sites show no evidence at all of informing and engaging with communities and workers on these salient issues. These are not new issues, and local employment, for example, is very often the very motivation for the local social license to operate. So how is it that so few sites share any information on this at all? Now here is a composite view showing the huge gap in mine site data on the most basic issues. Again, in this case, each bar represents one of the 250 mine sites. And at the extreme right of the chart, there's a gap for the 16 mine sites that show no information at all on any of these issues. So this seems to show a significant disparity between declared corporate systems and the systematic implementation of those systems at operational level. Company analysts repeatedly say that trust is the most important issue affecting mining operations. Yet this is the third index report, even though we have lowered the expectations for mine site reporting, where we see that the results are still very weak. This should surely be, in our view, a burning question that the industry should pose to itself in terms of the effectiveness of its harm prevention, risk limitation, and trust building systems that are so important to its own effectiveness and success. And here you see the gap that we see still needs to be filled. Well, here is another way of looking at the results. What you see on the screen are the three measurement areas that are used in the assessment. Commitment on the left, which is the policy level, action, which has to do with implementation, and then effectiveness, which is the performance tracking and corrective action, something which Ed was referring to earlier in his introduction. So once again, what you see here is that each bar reflects one of the companies, and we see that the commitment results are looking quite respectable. So it is clearly within every company's reach to meet the basic commitment expectations of society. But bear in mind that the commitment area is still a limited number of mine sites, a limited number of indicators, and most of the indicators are found in the action and effectiveness areas. And of course, this is where we see the weakest performance. There's much less evidence clearly of systematic implementation of commitments and even less evidence of effectiveness tracking, where progress is definitely the slowest, and one needs to see a lot more work for companies to be compelling in their ESG management. Now, moving on to some highlights, and there's so much in the report, both in the substantive summary report that we present as a PDF on the website, but also the full details that you can find on the website report, which we can only touch on with highlights in this short introduction. So we are pleased to note that we have seen signs of growing attention to the disclosure of data on the management of ESG issues over the years. And with each edition, the number of documents increases. This time, we saw the volume of documents grow by 45% to more than 6,500 documents that had to be assessed. Incidentally, you will find all of these in the searchable document library on the website. Although we saw a 45% increase in the volume of documents, that doesn't mean that one sees the same level of improvement in the scoring and the achievements of the companies. So there's a conversation to be had around the volume of reporting or the volume of data being made available versus the value and the substance in the data being made available. One example we'd like to highlight is one of the companies that has been included in all three of the reports published, and they published their first ever sustainability report last year. So a great effort by this team, and we look forward to much more in the future. On the management of human rights issues, one remains surprised to see such low results, despite the fact that nearly every company now publishes a commitment to human rights, and we've had the guiding principles on business and human rights around for more than a decade. This diagram shows that the average score is at 22%, with the maximum achievement only at 53%, with very little change, we must say, over the three indexes that have been published. When it comes to human, land, water, and labor rights defenders, the results still show an average of only 15%, even though this indicator measures merely a commitment to defend the rights of rights defenders. It's not even to take any action. And what you see there is that one company did manage to get 100% score, but the average, as you can see, is pretty low. And given the level of attacks and murders of defenders in many regions, this lack of acknowledgement to this issue by the industry is quite troubling to observe. So moving on to climate. Climate issues, one observes again a lower than expected result, given the prominence of climate change in the industry discourse and how much climate relevant publicity has been coming from the companies of late. The maximum score here you see is only 51%, with an average of 20%. Given the attention it's receiving, one hopes to see significant and radical improvement in the score in future. Water is another issue on which we see little change. Some of you will be familiar with this from the last report when we highlighted something similar. And so what we see is that where it is a matter of quantity, in other words, material to the operations of the company, one sees much more evidence than for the quality of downstream water that is a salient matter for other water users, but less important for the company. This contrast between reporting on water quantity and quality issues has not changed very much over the last 3 assessments either. And it's a curious thing that one would want to see that water that's a matter of life that people have to drink, that it should be treated with more respect. On the matter of pandemics, which of course is very prominent for everybody, the current pandemic started already in early 2020. So it is surprising for us to see that there's very little evidence of companies by now with established proactive systems to respond to pandemics and outbreaks of high burden diseases in a systemic way, despite the fact, of course, that there are individual examples of admirable support that one hears about from time to time, but it's not yet something that's systemically embedded within company structures. Moving on to the issue of gender, we've recently published a research insight devoted to the issue of gender. Mining associations and others acknowledge that women and girls are disproportionately affected by the impacts of mining. Yet little action is evident either for women as mine workers or women as community members. It seems that only at the executive level that companies pay attention to gender in the context of diversity. Clearly, there's much to be done here, given the impact at the local level and the growing number of women who act as workers within the mining companies. The last issue we'd like to highlight here is the concept of just transition. So this concept is getting more and more attention. People are learning to understand what it means and what the implications are, particularly in the context of energy transition and coal mine closure. Yet only one company out of the 40 can fully demonstrate that it has a system for developing post-closure transition management plans in collaboration with other affected stakeholders and workers. Again, an area that one assumes will get a lot more attention in future. So what does this mean for the future of mining? Mining companies know what needs to be done, we rather think. There's plenty of guidance and good practice already evident, and this report highlights many more leading practices that have been identified through the assessment process. And in fact, 37 of the 40 companies achieve one of the best scores for at least one indicator. So we see leadership emerging across the spectrum of companies. It's not only in a few companies, but really there's the potential for leadership across all the companies. So we're often asked, but what will it take to normalize responsible mining? And we're also asked, what are the drivers that lead to action? So I'd like to end by just highlighting that the research of the past few years has shown us that there really are 3 main drivers for action. And those are firstly, binding requirements, regulation and legislation, whether it's by governments, by regional bodies, by multilateral institutions, or even by mining associations, creating barriers to entry, setting certain standards. Secondly, is the reaction by companies and regulators or governments to catastrophe or scandal. We see those in the newspapers from time to time, and often those lead to radical action and the intention to mitigate and avoid for the future. And thirdly, in terms of what drives action, is the leadership by companies and their associations, who exercise their freedom of choice to step ahead, to do the right thing for stakeholders and shareholders, and to lead towards responsible mining. This is the one area where companies really have the freedom to choose if they want to lead and how. And with that, I'm going to hand back to you, Ed, and I look forward to what our colleagues on the panel have to say this morning.
And thank you very much. That's given us a really good starting point for the discussions, and thank you for giving us sort of such a great overview of the findings. I think you really set out the changes that we can start to see over the indexes, some of the challenges which are highlighted, and also pointing towards some of the leading practices which are going to help us drive improvement going forward. So thank you very much. There's a lot of meat there for us to get into. So I'd like to bring in our panelists now and get them to respond to some of these issues. And I'd like to start with Tania Tchedaeva from Polymetal. Tania, Hélène talked about two issues, the improvement in some of the companies and also mine site performance. Polymetal showed a 20% improvement from its 2020 score at corporate level, and also you're the best performing company at mine site level. So Tania, I'd love you to tell us how your executive team uses the RMI framework and the results from the RMI report to drive ESG improvement in your company. Tania, please.
We believe that full disclosure of information is very important, and we work a lot with many different proxy agencies and report providers, and once we receive information or we see the framework, we see where we can improve straight away, and we do a gap analysis, and the RMI framework is a very good example how we approach it. So if we see that such important rating pays special attention to information that is drilled down to the site level, we take this as an opportunity to provide further disclosure. And how we approach it is that on the one hand, yes, we do disclose, but on the other hand, this gives us an opportunity for as a company to see where we're doing well and where we're doing not so well, and address issues if they are. And this is the main reason why we think disclosure of information is so important. So for example, if we see that our older mines perform really well and our newer mines perform not so well, just because there is still culture development of culture in progress, or we have, for example, more supplies than we have in the older sites, we see this as an opportunity to improve this particular operation and to introduce the methods that we already use at our older sites, for example, and help the management to cross-reference where there is a gap. So that's mainly how we use the framework. And once we have this information accumulated, we use this again as a tool to produce more generic reporting, and this all filters into our disclosures that we must produce, for example, as a primary listed company like TCFD, and this information that we already have makes it reasonably simpler to produce reports that we release to the wider market.
Tania, thank you very much. I think I think it's always so interesting to hear from companies themselves, sort of actually how they're working on these issues behind the scenes, almost, to really understand how these changings are happening. So Tania, thank you. Glen, I'd like to move on to you. So Glen Mpufane from IndustriALL, the global union. Glen, your organization represents 50 million workers, as fundamental workers' rights are still a burning issue at many mine sites, and harm is also exacerbated by climate change and persistent gender inequality. How do you interpret the results of the RMI report for 2022? Glen.
Thank you, Ed. Firstly, let me congratulate the RMF for this latest edition of the index reporting benchmark series. The index is important for mine workers in how it tracks ESG performance, trends and developments, but more importantly, pointing to best practice and thereby enabling us as a global union to hold mining companies to the accountability fire, as it were, in terms of individual results and collectively as an industry. Now to your questions directly. Climate change, I'll start with climate change, because it is a workers' issue, and it speaks to fundamental trade union rights, and I'll explain further on. Now, climate change, as it relies on critical raw materials for the low carbon energy transition, the expected and predicted exponential growth in demand place mine workers in the direct path of harm. In satisfying that demand, the race to the bottom phenomenon in terms of violations of workers' rights is likely to increase. Actually, the Human Rights Resource Center has reported 167 allegations against 37 companies mining lithium, cobalt, copper, manganese, and nickel for the low carbon energy transition. And Hélène touched on this, this is the reason behind workers' demands for just transition mitigation measures. And just to share with you, I was just looking at the World Benchmark Alliance survey, and the results, basically complement, what Hélène has been saying, right? The vast majority of emitting companies fail to demonstrate efforts towards just transition. One, people most affected are being left out of the decision-making process that affect their future. Three, companies must commit to reskilling workers or risk a stranded workforce. They're not doing that. Business is still not using their influence to protect people, manage social impacts, and advocate for a just transition. A just transition needs to be underpinned by companies' respect for human rights. Now, you spoke about the first iteration of the report, of the index, where we found that the working conditions, thematic, and related indicators performed the worst. It is worrying that in terms of this report that the trend seemed to hold. Working conditions, as we know, indicators assess the extent to which companies are ensuring a safe and healthy workplace, respect for workers' rights, elimination of unfair or abusive labor practices, including gender-based violence and sexual harassment. While we recommend the report's finding that all companies show evidence of a formalized commitment to ensure safe and healthy working conditions, and having assigned responsibility at the senior management level or board level for carrying out these commitments, we remain concerned that COVID-19, and Hélène alluded to that, exposed the fragility of the system to respond to such crises, and that mine workers suffered the brunt of the pandemic. The ILO's fundamentals workers' rights are under constant pressure, and on the back of that, health and safety is now the subject of ILO processes to add it to the suite of ILO fundamental rights. Similarly, gender-based violence and sexual harassment is rampant, as you know, in the sector. Worryingly, but not unexpectedly, the report notes that, and this is a concern, half of the companies make no mention of having systems in place to protect women workers from intimidation, harassment, sexual harassment, or gender-based violence. Those companies that do typically address only one or two of these issues. Very few demonstrate that they have systems in place to ensure that operation address all these dimensions. And we wonder why the culture of GBV and sexual harassment continue to persistently raise its ugly head. Not to mention the lack of victim support to the extent that it may exist if it does. And once again, ILO processes are unfolding to integrate gender-based violence and sexual harassment into the ILO Convention 176 on minor health, health and safety, positive development. But it's still up to the companies to implement in their policies. This is in addition to the Convention 190, ILO Convention 190, which is a new global standard aimed at ending violence and harassment. And it is our hope that future iterations of the index will indicate some performance improvement, particularly at mine site level, where the women worker indicator show the lowest score, and we are concerned about that. Because this is a foundation of the fundamental workers' rights, in terms of insofar as it affects women. And that is worrying, as this indicates an embedded, difficult to dislodge cultural practice and behavior in the industry. That is our collective challenge, to put an end to this insidious, abhorrent behavior, and the mining industry dare not fail. Thank you very much, That would be my contribution.
Thank you very much, Glenn. You've really outlined some important issues there and set down a strong marker as well. So yeah, thank you very much. Certainly some challenges there. Also, just to note, I'm seeing some really good questions coming in the questions and answers. The Responsible Mining Foundation team are answering some of those in the text, but we can see some really good ones for our panelists to follow up on afterwards. So please do keep those questions coming. I'd like now to bring in Elisa Peter from Publish What You Pay. Elisa, Publish What You Pay was founded 20 years ago and has been at the forefront of many of the changes in the sector, particularly around disclosure, transparency, and accountability. What issues in the RMI findings stand out for you and resonate with some of the issues that you're involved with at Publish What You Pay? Elisa.
Thank you, Ed. And it's a pleasure to be here today. So thanks for the invitation. First of all, I wanted to echo others in congratulating the Responsible Mining Foundation for the third edition of the index. We at Publish What You Pay always look forward to the publication of the report, as it remains one of the most authoritative sources of information out there on corporate responsibility or lack thereof in the mining sector. So for those of you who don't know us, Publish What You Pay is the international movement of civil society organizations working to promote transparency, public participation, and accountability in the oil, gas, and mining sectors. So what we're taking away from this year's report is that there's been some timid progress, mostly by the companies that were really underperforming on ESG, but that overall we're still very far from the transparency and accountability standards that Publish What You Pay and others, such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the EITI, have been promoting for the past 20 years. Are we surprised? No. The communities, the local civil society organizations with which we work, who are impacted by mining, tell us the same story day in and day out. So I'd like to focus on three key findings here: contract disclosure, gender, and project level reporting. On contract disclosure, the index shows that none of the companies have achieved full transparency about the licenses or the legal agreements they have with governments. 3/4 of those companies have not disclosed any legal title. This is despite contract disclosure being a requirement in the EITI standard since January last year, as well as policies or statements supporting contract transparency from the IMF, the International Bar Association, the OECD, the United Nations, the IFC, MIGA, the EBRD, and others. So we really welcome the recent commitment by ICMM on contract transparency. We're really excited about that. It now means that there's 33 mining companies globally that publicly support license disclosure. But that's only a first step. And as Hélène showed at the beginning of the presentation, is that we need those policies and commitments to translate into practice and to be implemented. And so we really hope that many more mining licenses will be made publicly available in full in the next few months as a result of the ICMM new commitment on contract disclosure. And you can expect us, Publish What You Pay, to keep watching these developments and exposing the underperformers through our Disclose the Deal campaign around the world, which I think you can find a website in the chat. The second highlight I wanted to focus on is gender. So picking up on the previous speaker, there is plenty of evidence that women are disproportionately impacted by mining. They see fewer of the direct benefits, and they suffer more from especially the high levels of corruption in the sector. So it's really disappointing to see that only 3 companies make even minimal reference to including gender aspects in their social impact assessments. And there's no evidence of any specific gender impact assessment having taken place. So Publish What You Pay has developed with others, including Oxfam, 18 key principles for feminist natural resource governance agenda, and I'm happy to share those later on, which we think must underpin natural resource management by both companies and governments. Publish What You Pay will also be supporting stronger disclosures relevant to women's rights during the revision of the EITI standard in the coming months. For instance, on the need for gender disaggregated data on the beneficiaries of social and environmental expenditures and transfers by mining companies. And then thirdly, and lastly, I wanted to come back to the issue of mine site level reporting, picking up on what Hélène said earlier. This is still very weak in all companies, and it's really quite striking how so little information is disclosed on key issues such as water or air quality, local employment, tailings, wages, issues that are often central to community grievances. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center has developed a tracker specifically on transition minerals, and nearly 40% of the human rights allegations that they tracked back in 2021 related to water, either water pollution or access to water. And the risk that this trend escalates as demand for transition minerals intensifies to meet the production need of renewable energy is huge. So disclosures at project level can play a critical role in building more engagement with communities, in ensuring human rights due diligence and solid local consent for mining. So to conclude, we want to see stronger leadership in the mining sector on transparency and accountability. Our experience at Publish What You Pay tells us that it is possible. There's been tremendous progress on fiscal transparency over the past 20 years, with great benefits for the mining industry and for citizens of resource-rich countries. And we need the same kind of ambition for a wider range of disclosures now. Thank you, Ed.
Elisa, thank you very much. I really like that call for stronger leadership and that it is possible as well. Thank you. So I'm going to move to Luc Zandvliet now. Luc Zandvliet is from RRR Alliance. And Luc, you've been working alongside the industry for 2 decades now as well as having been on the advisory council of the Responsible Mining Foundation. So Luc, what changes or otherwise stand out for you from those 6 years of the index?
Thanks, Ed. That's a good question. And actually, I would like to make 3 points that are connected and that relate to change. The first one, the question you asked. First point I would like to make is that I am a bit upset and slightly bewildered by the results of the report, and to be more pointed by the lack of change. Second point is that for me it validates a concern that putting it a bit of a higher on a higher level, that the current ESG model that most companies, mining companies, use is close to its expiry date, or actually maybe has already passed its expiry date. And third, that we actually need a new model, and I think this report validates that. And I would see that some of the building blocks laid out in this report actually identify what an adapted model could look like. So let me briefly explain that. I am disappointed that we see little progress relative to the previous report. In some cases, I think, and Elisa and Glen and Hélène pointed out, in some cases, I dare say it's a bit embarrassing, frankly, especially for companies that profile themselves as leaders in the industry. We know how to do this stuff. The RMI doesn't ask any kind of fringe questions, and in fact, in most cases, I think the indicators refer to questions that, frankly, any CEO or CEO should be asking. So to me, it is the question, why is that not the case? Why do we still see the results where I think there's one company that reaches more than 50% overall? We know what good looks like. We know what effective looks like. And we know that across the world, many of the indicators related to ESG are both highly predictable and also highly preventable, right? We've seen it, we've studied it, we've experienced it, and we work with companies on a day-to-day basis to actually address these issues. And what I think is quite powerful in the report is that it shows it can be done. That collective best score feature in the report signals the highest score for each indicator, regardless of the company. And to me, it's a great feature because it is basically, it's about will to do it. It's not that it cannot be done because someone else has actually already done it. So the first point to me is, it raises the questions about the boards of companies, right? What are the boards asking? If the RMI score serves as a proxy for ESG risk management, then I really hope that the board members are taking a look at the scores and using the framework to ask some real pertinent questions. So that's my first point. But there's a second point, and it relates to the bigger picture. I do feel that we see stagnating company scores in a context that's rapidly changing, and Hélène pointed out a few examples. I think it's fair to say that at this moment, the gap between how the industry performs on the one side and what society is expecting on the side, that gap is widening, and the report pointed that out. And in fact, I do think that there's always been kind of an implicit contract between companies and host communities, at least on the social side. And that contract is coming to an end. And what that contract basically said is, we will dig a big hole in your backyard if you accept that. And in return for digging a big hole in your backyard, we will leave you better off, right? And we leave you better off compared to how we found you. And that assumption has proven to be a challenge, because there are very few examples where companies can actually demonstrate this, even on the site level. So what I'm very concerned about is that it leads to a number of countries, and we don't have to mention name, but I think we all know who they are, where mining activities are no longer possible because the current business and the ESG model doesn't provide the value proposition. It is simply not enough. There is no trust. So if you then assume that mining companies, they base themselves largely on two assumptions. One is that products are needed for society, indispensable, Hélène called it. And on the other side, there is an acknowledgement that, yes, we want to try to leave communities better off than we find them, right? You look at the oil industry, and the oil industry also thought that oil would be there forever, and they're turning themselves now into energy companies because that assumption no longer holds place. So my concern is that where the assumption that the world needs mining projects is possibly can be challenged in the future. Think about artificial diamonds, for example. And if you're not able to demonstrate that you leave communities better off in the process of doing that, that should really serve as a wake-up call that a paradigm shift is needed. That leads me to my third point then. We need a new model. It's not about tweaking. It's about a fundamental paradigm shift. It is about reframing that social contract between companies and local stakeholders. It's about putting people and the environment at the core of a mine design process, right? It's about jointly defining what a post-closure vision looks like, what success looks like, and to use the life of mine as a vehicle to materialize that vision. It's about modernizing agreement making, right? And to work towards a situation where community groups have actually a meaningful voice in decision making. And that's not revolutionary, it's not far-fetched. And in fact, if you look at the social closure toolkit of the ICMM, the idea that you inform your mine design by how you want to leave it is actually all in there. It's great, right? So the policy practice gap remains the problem, and company practice remains to be lagging. So to conclude, I see that the RMI criteria go to the heart of putting people and environment central, and they're building blocks. They're building blocks for a new model. And to me, the value of this report is not only that it assesses company performance, but that it really could serve as a tool for companies to rethink their approach and to rethink their model. So that's why I hope companies will really take note of this report, not only how it reflects back on past experiences, but also on past findings, but really how it could inform future decision making. That's it, Ed. Thanks.
Luc, thank you very much. Again, setting out a big challenge for us and the need for a new model as well. So I'm looking forward to sort of digging into that a bit more. I'm going to move now to Rohitesh Dhawan from ICMM. Rose, similar to Publish What We Pay, ICMM was founded a bit over 20 years ago, as we said, when the industry was in crisis and needed to build trust with society that it could do the right thing. Where do you see the opportunities for accelerating the implementation and normalization of responsible mining, and particularly in that sort of 20-year time frame that we've moved on from? Ro, over to you.
Ed, thank you so much. You know, it's customary to thank the organizers and the moderator for the opportunity. In this case, I really, really sincerely mean it, because of the 40 companies that were assessed in this year's report, 18 are ICMM companies. And, you know, to be totally frank and honest, it's a strange situation to be in with the microscope so clearly focused on the companies that form ICMM and, of course, non-ICMM companies. But I personally think that's a very healthy and creative tension. And that's why I want to really congratulate Hélène, Jennifer, Pierre, and the rest of the RMI team for producing this piece of work. You know, we may have differences of opinion on exactly parts of the analysis or the methodology, but what I know we are totally united in is a mission that ICMM had 20 years ago, Ed, as you correctly mentioned, which is how long ICMM's now been in existence as of this year. Our mission then and our mission now, and I believe, as I interpret it, RMF's mission, which is to ensure that the benefits of mining are maximized to the people it most affects, and that any harm caused by mining is minimized. We are totally united in that vision. And so any attempt and any action that helps us get there, I believe, needs to be encouraged and welcomed. And that's why I think I'm so privileged and glad to be part of this conversation. Ed, I'd just like to highlight 3 parts of the report's findings with some reflections that we can go into. The first of those, and a few speakers have already spoken about that, have been the gaps in site level reporting. And here I'm pleased to be able to share that starting this year, towards the end of this year, ICMM's performance expectations that were last updated in 2018 will start to generate site-level assessments for the ICMM member companies. So that means that annually there will be site-level information made available about the extent to which ICMM companies are meeting the performance expectations that are captured in the 10 ICMM mining principles. And so, this report, for example, covers 250 sites. The number of sites that will be covered by the ICMM disclosures are in the region of 650 sites. So I think the finding about the greater need for site level information is absolutely appropriate, and we certainly will be in a position to provide more of that come towards the end of this year. The second thing to say in terms of the findings of the report were about the fact that there is a wide extent of divergence between the issues that different companies are reporting on. And here I just wanted to flag the development of a new mining sector standard under the GRI. As ICMM, we report in line with GRI and have long done so. And we're active participants in the development of a GRI sector standard for mining. I'm sure many of you will share the view that I'm about to share, which is that I think we would all be better off if we aligned around a smaller number of standards when it came to responsible mining and disclosures. The wide disparity of which, I'll be totally frank, we as ICMM contribute to that disparity because our mining principles and performance expectations are one of several standards for responsible mining. I don't think that wide divergence and dispersion serves the needs of people that have an interest in the mining industry. It doesn't serve companies particularly well because of the burden of audits and the need to express information in many different ways. And it certainly doesn't serve those who are seeking this information to understand impacts at a very visceral level. And so I really hope that the GRI process is just one, but more broadly, that we can come together as everybody who has a stake in various mining standards to converge on a smaller number of standards for responsible mining. But I highlighted GRI in particular because I think that is an imminent process that will help us, I believe, align on a set of material issues in the mining sector that will hopefully over time reduce the divergence and spread that we see in the report on the issues that are being covered as the report showed us. So that was my second perspective, Ed. And then the final thing I wanted to mention was that the report correctly lays focus on critical indicators that appear not to be well served by current disclosures. I'm here thinking of something Glen, of course, spoke very passionately about, and I know all of us will share a deep concern about, which is the prevalence of sexual assault, bullying, and racism, as we've seen new data emerge in the early part of this year. And here again, I'm able to share that in the next few months, ICMM will be releasing a consistent method of reporting socioeconomic benefits, which will cover 8 key indicators that will allow for consistent reporting across ICMM companies and, of course, hopefully as a result, across the wider industry. Importantly, those indicators include elements of the living wage, which correctly this report identifies as being critical to delivering real benefit to communities. It will also disaggregate data by gender. And so once again, I hope that in the coming months, we will be able to demonstrate progress on this most important issue of being able to demonstrate the impacts disaggregated by diversity criteria and indeed by living wage. So Ed, let me just end by saying, some of you may have heard me say this before, but it really is something that to me encapsulates why I joined ICMM a year ago and why I continue to believe in the extraordinary and important role of voluntary business leadership on advancing progress on these issues. And that, of course, is a quote by Maya Angelou, who said, "Do the best until you know better, and when you know better, do better." So while I really hear Luke's concern about stalled progress, the reason why I think moments like today and this report are so critical, and what I believe all of ICMM's work is geared to doing, is to constantly search for better. And when we know better, then to do better. And with that, let me just end and congratulate once again Hélène and the team for this important contribution, which hopefully creates the conditions for us to collaborate in finding solutions to some of these most intractable but most critical issues. Thanks, Ed.
Right, thank you very much. And thanks to all the panelists. So we've heard, in a way, a huge consistent message across all of you. And maybe I'd just like to ask all of our panelists to switch on their videos, and we'll come to questions for all of you. But we've heard consistent messages from all of you. I think, you know, huge, Ro, as you said, sort of huge alignment in the vision and the ambitions between everyone. Real acknowledgement that there has been some progress over the past 20 years, but also critical that we are a long way off what is needed and what's expected. And Luke, as you said, perhaps that gap is actually widening between kind of progress and expectation. So a real massive challenge. There's some really good questions in the questions and answers, but I just want to pick one theme that runs through all of that, is the really real question around how can we drive that change? How can we achieve better? I think the questions are really kind of touching on that. Is in some ways we do know better. Actually, what are the biggest drivers for pushing that change to the next stage? We've had questions around guidance and manuals, you know, to what extent are they useful? Legal cases and legal action and regulatory frameworks and the power of that. Commodity markets and their ability to sort of reward and incentivize kind of two tiers, so that they reward their progress and more responsible mining. Multi-stakeholder initiatives, to what extent sort of working together in collaboration can work and help drive that. Investor standards like IFC performance standards, should we be using that more? You know, Ro, I think you talked about the sort of role of standards and the standardization of standards within that. Push for disclosure as well. There's a question around sort of GRI really helping push and standardize disclosure, but potentially the potential to drive mine site level, in particular disclosure, in particular mine site level disclosure. But also the role of civil society as well, in terms of community-based assessments, but also the role of advocacy. So in all of that, I'd like to sort of go back to each of our panelists and ask them, what do they see as, I'm going to ask you a real challenge of one particular driver for that change. What's going to make that big change in the next 6-10 years to drive change? So maybe Glen, I'm going to start with you. What do you see as the sort of one big thing that might be able to drive this improved performance that we're looking for?
Yeah, I think there's you know, consensus and agreement that external requirements, you know, are the best drivers of change. And juxtapose that with the absence of a binding treaty, you know, on business conduct, the emergence of mandatory due diligence, you know, I think it's a carrot and stick approach, you know, that will drive change, and therefore the role also for voluntary standards, you know, to the extent that they meet a particular criteria to you know, Ro's point. You cannot have a proliferation of standards. You know, we know ICAL is you know, guiding that, but at the same time, and it has to do with standards that are mineral specific, standards that are generic, covering all minerals, standards that look at the, I think we're seeing an emergent trend of standards looking at the mine site level, which is a great thing. And yeah, there are multiple, if you like, but you cannot have a free for all, literally, you know, and which is, and we are all for less standards, equivalence, and we are excited that, you know, what Roy is saying about the GRI. It's the most widely used standard, you know, by business across sectors, but it's not necessarily the best in, you know, satisfying these requirements that I'm talking about, multi-stakeholderism, for instance, you know. And so we will be participating in that process, and we will be hoping to bring in that process some of these drivers that we believe would be effective for that change. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So those external requirements and particularly standards being an important driver in that. Elisa, I'd like to come to you now. What do you see as perhaps some of the biggest drivers to create change? Just very briefly.
Thanks, Ed. So completely agree with Glen, what Glen said. I think talking from an advocacy organization, I feel like our toolbox to accelerate change is expanding. So of course, everything that's been said around legislation, mandatory requirements, as well as voluntary initiatives are things that we've promoted in the past. And right now, I just want to flag the work we're doing on the EU directive on non-financial reporting, which will address a lot of the issues that we've discussed today in regards to mining impacts. But beyond those kind of like traditional focuses of advocacy organizations, I think there's two really interesting developments recently that I think are relevant also to our conversation today. The first one is investors' action or shareholders' activism. So we've seen that more in the oil and gas sector, but I think this is starting also in the mining sector, where investors are putting pressure on companies and or governments issuing mining licenses to uphold some minimal standards around environmental and social impacts. And shareholders as well, right? Shareholders of like publicly listed mining companies are increasingly aware of ESG risks and want to lower those risks. Another thing, and I'll leave it at that, is that we're seeing increasingly used is strategic litigation. So communities taking companies to court for the impacts they have on the communities, their environment, and so on. And so again, we've seen that more in the oil and gas sector, but I think in the context of the energy transition, where we see a boom in demand in transition minerals, I think strategic litigation targeted at mining companies might be on the rise in the next few years. Thanks.
Lisa, thank you very much. So Elisa, you talked about some of these big initiatives which are sort of coming into play, and Glen mentioned some of them as well. So like the ICMM initiative and sort of ICMM's commitments, the EU directive, and also the EU taxonomy as well as the binding treaty on business and human rights as well. So I think there's a lot of these external requirements which are coming into play, and we might see having some traction. But I also really like your point there around the role of investors, and yeah, really interesting that you've seen that really change in recent years, and the role of strategic litigation as well. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that we're starting to see that drive action and change as well. Tania, maybe can I come to you from Polymetal's point of view? From your point of view, what do you think is going to drive change within Polymetal over the next few years?
What we see, mining companies have been for a very long time behind social license to operate. And yes, there is a lot of regulation around, but what we think is that mining companies work very closely with the people on the ground, and every mining company should be taken very responsibly what they do, how they use resources responsibly, how we make sure that we don't damage environment, how we ensure that we do a lot of work on biodiversity, on restoring the ground that we use for our mining operations. We invest a lot of money and effort into promoting well-being of people on the ground, invest in education, invest in promoting jobs for local people. And we think this what is behind all the efforts that mining companies are trying to do to make sure that there is change happening. And yes, there is a lot of regulation. And again, like Glen said, there is so much on the plate for the mining companies on disclosure front. And we very much hope that there is going to be some sort of convergence between different requirements. But what is in the basis of a good effectively good corporate citizen, we've been talking about this for the past 10 years at least, and this is basically what makes a good company thrive.
Tania, thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting to see the sort of that internal response to those external requirements and the huge amount of work that's needed within companies to disclose in order to meet those requirements. But I also really like your point about all of those different issues which internally within a company you need to work on. You know, there's 80 plus indicators in the Responsible Mining Index, and as a company you have to sort of work on those. But critically, that importance of investing time and money, I think, you know, just the reality of the time and money that needs to be invested by companies to actually make these changes. You know, I like the fact that you make it really practical like that. So Tania, thank you. Ro, I'd like to come to you now. I think, you know, you outlined already some of the changes that you'd like to see, but I'd like to sort of come back to you about, you know, changes that you, or the things, the drivers that will make this change that we're talking about.
Thank you. I'm going to cheat a little and just do two, if it's okay, and they're linked, but I will be quick.
Briefly, yeah.
The first is to say, you asked what would make change happen. Well, quite simply, it would be to do what we say. And Helene's graph shows us the power of doing what we say to close the gap between commitments and action. And I just used an example here, Ed, of the global industry standard in tailings management, which ICMM members have, of course, committed to implementing in a very clear time frame in the coming years. And our focus is entirely on implementing that standard. We simply cannot have the standard and then shift our eye off the ball for doing the things that are required to be in conformance with that standard as quickly as possible. So that's an example of a really good standard that I think we all feel moves the industry along in a big way on the safe management of tailings facilities. Now, the real priority is implementing it. So that's an example of what I hope we will carry through into other aspects as well. The linked part to it, the second thing that I think will help move us along, Ed, is to show really visible examples of where things can work. And this again is the spirit of the report. The spirit of the report is about showing what's possible. And what I mean by really visible examples is situations on the ground where we can see these things in action. And perhaps, and Luke, of course, has talked passionately about how, you know, there is a need to redefine potentially the contract that has existed for many years. And I think showing where things can work is one way to do what Luke is asking us to do. But the one I would just point to is the work, for example, in South Africa, which many stakeholders are involved in around the impact catalyst, which has created a situation where previously mined land is a source of socioeconomic development and opportunity post-mine closure. This is something we all have for long talked about how we're going to do well. And this is an example of where in live we're learning what can really work and how it can be replicated. So more of that, Ed, I think, would really help us demonstrate these principles in action.
Right, thank you very much. I really like that focus on implementation. That's certainly one of the themes that's come out of the Responsible Mining Index, is this sort of, the companies have over the past 20 years made the commitments, many policy commitments. They're demonstrating they've got plans in place. The real next stage is around effectiveness, getting on and doing things. And I like that sort of showing what we're doing on the ground as well. And again, reflected in the big gap in mine site level information, and sort of, I know from my own experiences, in many cases I know that information exists, and it's just a matter of sort of sharing it and demonstrating what's happening on the ground. But also those new business models. I think, Luke, you talked about sort of a need for a new business model, and things like the impact catalyst showing a different way of working. So Ro, thank you. Luke, I'd like to come to you briefly. And Glen, I see you've got your hand up. I'm going to come back to you in a moment. But Luke, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to that.
Sure, thanks. And it's actually a nice discussion. I want to go back to the framework that Hélène started off with the 3 factors to create change, and one of them was leadership. And I think if there is one thing that would be really helpful in creating change and that we collectively need to do much better, is to help leadership connect the dots. That ESG and risk is that ESG risk exposure is highly predictable, and therefore it's also highly preventable. I think we have collectively not done a good job in terms of laying out that some of the questions that are asked in, for example, the RMI, are directly linked to how you're perceived as a company, and therefore directly linked to your reputational risk, to your legal risk, to your environmental risk. And to me, it is low-hanging fruit, and it is probably something we've always overlooked. In terms of, to give you an example, it's really interesting to see the annual report that comes out. I think Ernst & Young is doing it in terms of what keeps CEOs awake at night. And the social or license elements are always top 1, 2, 3 years in a row. And then you look around and you look at the same company and you say, but you just let a lot of people go in your organization that are exactly specialized in addressing the risks that you say are actually keeping you awake at night. So to me, it signals that we have not done a good job in terms of saying this stuff is not a black box. This is not unpredictable. And I come more from the social perspective. Human behavior is highly predictable. We see across the world that the manifestations of that behavior may be different in different contexts, but the underlying causes about what ticks people off or what is appreciated are essentially the same. But we haven't made that connection clear enough, I think, to senior leadership to say, actually, you have control over your ESG risk exposure. This is doable, right? Finding ore somewhere under an ocean or in a hill somewhere, to me, is really difficult. This social environmental stuff in many ways is as predictable, right? So that's where we, I think, collectively need to do a better job in connecting the dots. And once that coin is dropping and has become more clear, then I think the rest will flow. Once leadership is seeing the link between change and risk management, then I think it makes it much easier.
Luke, thank you very much. That's a really important point around leadership. I think sort of in all the sort of standards that set standards for internal management systems and disclosure, I think, yeah, sometimes we forget the importance of leadership and individuals in that. And I think that's also sort of reflecting Tania's point around the need for investment and time to do this. So yeah, Luke, thank you very much. Hélène, I'm just going to come to you before we do a final round from each of the panelists. Hélène, I'd like your reflections on those big drivers for the change that we want to see.
So listening to everybody and all the agreement we have that we know what to do, let's just do it. So I'd like to just say that in a sense, we need to borrow that familiar marketing phrase that says, just do it. So that's the one thing. The other piece we haven't mentioned is culture. And I just want to reflect on something we quite often hear is the number of very dedicated employees in companies working on sustainability issues who so often tell us, I'm only one person or we're only two, there's so much to do, we don't have a budget, there's not enough of us, they've just cut our numbers or something like that. And I really think that this needs to be looked at from a culture perspective. We also spoke to a sustainability manager who was extremely dedicated, was applying the RMI framework to their company themselves to try and influence their board to show how much more needs to be done. But this gentleman also said, I can't bother the people on site with this stuff because they're busy with the real work. And so that's just a little icon of how we also need to look at culture in organizations and give the proper status and stature and agency to those driving ESG within companies. I'll leave it at that, Ed.
Thanks very much. Great point on the importance of culture there. So I'm just going to come around to each of the panelists. I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to have any closing comments and perhaps pick up on very briefly on any of the questions or topics that we might have missed in the Q&A, because I realize we haven't been able to cover all of them. Glen, I know you wanted to respond, so I'm going to start with you first. So very briefly, any final comments?
Very quickly, I think we should embed in the culture due diligence requirements, and we have not spoken much about the power of responsible sourcing. Responsible sourcing demands across the supply chain. It's a huge market incentive and driver of change, I believe. Thanks.
Ben, thank you very much. Ro, maybe to you, any final closing comments?
Thank you. Simply to underscore a point I think several of us have mentioned, which I hope becomes a shared agenda item for all of us working together in the future, which is on convergence. I really can't emphasize that enough as an important way in which I think will drive performance higher, will lead to improved disclosures, and will lead to better conversations of the type that I think Luke has encouraged us to have today. So my closing remark is simply to underscore the importance of that.
Right, thank you very much. Luke, over to you. Any final comments, observations from you?
Very short one is that basically is to see the report not only as a tool to assess past performance, but also to really use it as the input in internal conversations to say, okay, what's the way forward, and are we asking the right questions, are we doing the right thing? I thought I'm sneaking in the second point about change. The observation about target setting and the lack thereof, I think, is a very, very powerful one. And I hope that some of those recommendations actually are seen as not as externally imposed, but actually really as useful business tools. And I think the RMI identifies a number of those areas where it's good business, and I hope we can all learn from that. Thank you,
Luke. Thank you very much. Elisa, any final observations from you?
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, I wanted to put that conversation in the context of the energy transition, which we touched a little bit upon, but the energy transition is about to transform the mining industries worldwide, with coal production set to decline and the extraction of critical transition minerals needed for green technology set to increase significantly in the next year. So I just want to highlight how important transparency and disclosure of all the information we've discussed today is important to ensure that those huge supply chains are free from human rights violation, from environmental disasters. And for that, we need project level information. And we also need the big commodity trading companies. We haven't talked very much about them, but we also need to make sure that those big trading companies play their part in ensuring transparency in their own operations. Thanks.
Elisa, thank you very much. Tania, over to you for any final observations.
I think what we need to think about is the future of mining and where we're all going as an industry. And there is a massive brain drain from many industries, mining not being exempt. And there is a clear demand from the younger people about being responsible, being very careful about the environment, being very transparent in how you do your business. And I think this report helps mining industry a lot to show that there is very good future in the industry for the younger people who will hopefully move it forward.
Tania, thank you very much. That's a really good note to end on. So just a thanks from me to all of our panelists. I've really appreciated having better conversations with all of you. It's been fascinating to get all of your perspectives on the RMI index, but also sort of how far we've moved or not, and the real challenges for us as well. And I think some really exciting but big challenges to address as we move forward. So Hélène, I'm going to leave the final words to you. So over to you. Thank you, Hélène.
Great, Ed. Thank you so much to Ed, but also all the panelists for your spirited participation. And let's really make something of better conversations going forward. In terms of the just do it, let's just do it, as Tania said, for future generations, for the next generations to come. so that they can look back with pride on this generation and how we've dealt with mining. And then I also particularly want to acknowledge, really, as we touched on before, the dedicated sustainability people, professionals working in the mining industry, who often don't get recognized, who have a tough job, they don't have the highest status in the organization, but they're committed and they work really hard despite the challenges. And I think we should really acknowledge them as well. And where we do see results, it's because of people like that. So thank you to all of you. And then I want to acknowledge the help of my very dedicated colleagues and friends who are also here behind the scenes. Pierre and Jennifer, quickly put on your cameras because they're really the guts of what makes this happen. And then also to thank our very talented and also patient interpreters. Apologies for where we speak with passion and speed and make it really hard for you to follow. So to everyone listening in from so many time zones, thank you to everyone and goodbye.